Hi guys, welcome back to another webinar. Thanks for joining me again today in this webinar. On this webinar, we're going to be discussing calendars and how you create calendars. Firstly, what is a calendar? I'm going to go over to the Ning menu and head down to the calendar module. So the main use of the calendars is to have a clear view of all your statutory compliance events that are coming up in the future. It can be used for a wide variety of different things. It excels in logging your stat compliance, but it can also be used for other things like your weekly call point tests. You'll see that the calendar pulls through the event name, the date that it's going to be due, the due in date, and if it's overdue, it will flag red. Within the calendar functionality, we can send emails out to the person who needs to be notified to advise that that calendar event is coming up for inspection. The triggers that we can send out can go directly out to the contractor, or it can be sent to an internal user within Logit who manages your statutory compliance for your business. To give you an idea of what it looks like, I think that will be beneficial for you. So when it comes to building your calendar, you have an idea of what the finished product looks like. To create a calendar, I'm going to head over to the three dots and over to the configure portal. As we know, the configure portal is the back end of Logit, which is restricted to mainly super users. Calendars have a variety of different steps in order to get them working correctly. The steps are, first of all, are we going to be pulling through assets? Are we going to be pulling through contractors? Or are we going to be pulling through repositories? On one calendar, you can pull through all three. Assets is the most common one to pull through all your statutory compliance. We can pull through contractors onto a calendar which confirms, for example, the next liability due date. And we can also pull through repositories for stuff for events like when is the next health and safety assessment document due. The most commonly used one for calendars is assets to be pulled through. However, to pull through contractors and to pull through repositories, the process is very similar, and I'll show you how to do all three. So as I said, I'm going to be pulling through asset groups onto this calendar. To go down to the asset groups, we go to structuring assets and head down to the asset groups. And you'll see that we have asset groups created already. Within the calendar, you can pull through multiple asset groups onto the one calendar. A reason that you would have multiple asset groups is, for example, you could have one asset group for external, and on the external asset group we send notifications out to contractors. And for the internal asset group, we send an email out to the general manager of your business to advise that a statutory compliance event is coming up. And then they would either deal with it internally or speak to the third party who's going to come out and do the inspection. When it comes to creating your calculations of last inspection date and frequency, which updates the calendar with the next inspection date, instead of building these calculations into each asset group, what you can do is create a template and attach the template to multiple asset groups, which saves you time, also allows you to run a report in the back end to pull through all of the groups that are using the template that we create. So step number one, I'm going to create a template. I'm going to add a template and call this template stat compliance. This is where you pick where you want the template to be used for: asset group, locations, business entities, and documents. It can be used for all three. I'm going to create a template, and now this is where we want to add properties, which will then be put onto the asset groups and subsequently cascaded down to all the assets built underneath, which means When you enter the last inspection date, we build the calculations into the background, which says last inspection date in the frequency equals next inspection date, so the calendar can work efficiently. You're going to add a section. Section can be called static compliance and create. Works very similar to building a form. Once we have the section created, we can then start adding properties. The first question we want to do is inspection, and this is going to be the question type of date, and it's just going to be inspection. We can then pull these inspection date onto the form, so when you go to add record on the form, as we're building other calculations, it'll work all the calculations in the background and update the calendar. So that is the inspection. We then want to add another question, which is going to be a user-defined options, because we're going to say frequency. And this is where you advise of all the different frequencies within your statutory compliance events. Once I create them, if you want to come back and add more, all you do is go down to the template, click on user defined options, and you can add more as you go along. We now need to add a value next to each frequency, so Logit knows how many months are within that set frequency. So for example, you can use months, which will be 12, and then we can have 24 and 60. So we're just putting values next to each of the frequencies. The next property that we want to add is a next inspection date. And this question type is going to be calculated date. And the calculations that we want to use is last inspection date plus frequency in months, because the value I entered against my frequencies I created on the template, I used in months to enter the value. The next property I want to add is a due in. So the due in will tell you how many days until the next inspection date is due. And to do this, we want to use a calculated time span. The calculation is going to be the next due date minus today's date equals the amount of days until the next inspection. And I now want to also add another property, which is for file upload, which gives whoever is managing the calendar the ability to also attach a certificate to the calendar. A certificate, and we have now created that. Step number 1 is create your template, which is going to be used on your asset groups or your repositories or even your location. Step number 2, I'm going to be using assets to pull through onto the calendar. So step number 2 is create asset groups and assets. So first of all, what is an asset group? An asset group is essentially a folder for all of your assets to sit under. So when we create an asset group and we attach the template that we created on said asset group, all the assets that we create under the asset groups will have the template attached to it to then confirm the last inspection date and the frequency, which will then allow the asset to be pulled through onto the calendar. So step number 1 is I'm going to create an asset group. The asset group I'm going to create is called internal static compliance. The type is going to be physical. The difference between classification and physical is you cannot create assets under a classification asset group, but you can under physical. A classification asset group is essentially an asset group for an asset group. So it just gives you the ability to ensure that your asset groups are neat and tidy. And we can then say who it belongs to. So I'm going to attach this to the compliance asset group which has been created. We then have the ability to attach a contractor to the asset group, which gives you the ability to later down the line, when we set our triggers up, to email out a specific contractor for all of the different assets created under the asset group, as long as we have the trigger set up on the asset group on the calculations, which I'll show you in a second. We now have our first asset group created called internal stat compliance. We then want to add another one depending on your setup, but I want to add another one which says external stat compliance, as I know that my maintenance manager is actually going to be managing all of the internal stat compliance, and all of the external stat compliance is going to be picked up by a contractor or another third party. It's going to be a physical asset group because we want to build assets underneath this, and again it's going to sit under the compliance asset group that's already been created. There we have our internal stat compliance asset group and our external stat compliance group. Now you'll see why the template that we created is so handy. If I click on the internal stat compliance group and head over to properties, we then have the ability to add sections and put the calculations in under the asset group manually. However, if you have multiple asset groups pulled through onto the one calendar, instead of creating the calculations twice, one in each asset group, you can click add section and then just attach the template that we created with the calculations. So stat compliance. And there we have all of the properties that we created pulling directly through to this asset group. And if you go back to the external stat compliance, we can do exactly the same thing. It just saves you a lot of time if you're pulling through multiple asset groups onto the one calendar, not needing to create the calculations twice. We can pull them directly through onto multiple. At this point, we then have our two asset groups created. We can then say that the internal stat compliance, we want to set up triggers on this one, which says I want to add a trigger on the next inspection date, and the trigger is going to be 30 days before the due date. We want to send an email out to the contractor. Also, we can send out to specified email addresses depending on your setup. So if you have one user within your company who needs to be notified about all of the upcoming stat compliance events, then you can enter the email address here. You can also send an email out to the contractor, and as long as when you create the assets you have the contractor attached to that asset, 30 days before the due date of the event, we'll send an email out to the contractor to have a due date reminder. And you can also CC in someone within your business to the email address so you know that the contractor has been contacted. So that's how you set up triggers on the asset groups. So now, as we have our asset groups created, we have our properties attached to the asset group, we can then start to add the events that are going to pull through onto the calendar. So to do so, they need to be added as assets. Head to the Assets tab and select Add Asset. Confirm the asset group that it's going to sit under, so we know that it's going to sit under either the internal or the external depending on what you're adding. It could be that the annual boiler service you want to add, and this is going to be managed by a third party contractor, so we're putting it under the external stat compliance, and it's going to be at the Edinburgh Hotel. Select the departments. If it has a contractor, this is where you assign it, and click Create. I want to find the asset that I have just created, which you can see is the annual boiler service. When I click Edit, as I created the properties under the asset group of external stat compliance, and we created the annual boiler service under this asset group, the properties automatically will pull through for all of the assets created under that asset group. So now if we say the last inspection date was the 2nd of the 2nd 2024 and the frequency is yearly, the calculations will automatically be made in the back end to confirm the next inspection date and also the next due in date. Please bear in mind that you only ever need to add the inspection date here when you first create the assets. Once you have the calendar created, this will all be managed within the calendar itself, but to get that to show on the calendar, it needs to have a last inspection date and the frequency held against it, so the calendar knows what needs to be calculated from against. Then I want to add another asset for our internal asset group, and this is going to be pat testing. Location, we'll keep it at the Edinburgh Hotel. Maintenance department, and there's no contractor because it's going to be done internally. And we click create. We now have our pat testing that we created, and if we click edit, you'll see we have the calculations again because we attached it under internal stat compliance asset group. And now if we put the inspection date as 2020, and this is actually going to be done every year as well, it will say the next inspection date because of the calculations that we created, and you can see that it's now overdue by a certain amount of days. So we've now created our template, we've created our asset groups, we've created our assets. The next thing that we want to do is then start creating the calendar. So to create a calendar, the next 3 steps is build the form, turn it into a record, then create the calendar. And that is very easy to do. So step 1, head up to the form library. Click add form. The reason we want to create a form is so when the inspection has been done, they select add record, type in the new inspection date, so we can then update the asset properties in the background. So step 1 is create the form. The first form that I want to create is internal stat compliance record. Please note, if you have multiple asset groups, you'll need to create separate forms and records for each asset group. Confirm the department. The form type is going to be asset because we have created this under asset group. If you're going to be pulling through documents, you would obviously select documents as well as contractors. Select the asset group this form applies for, and then we want to hit create. Now we want to add the questions that we want to be within the record. Because I want the asset group to automatically update in the background with the last inspection date when the record's created against the calendar, I want to pull through that property from the asset group onto this form. To do so, we want to add a section. And this section type is going to be asset group properties because we want to pull through the properties created within the asset group. Click create. And now we want to link the properties to the template that we created under the asset group. And I want to pull through the inspection date. And I also want to pull through the certificates. You see there's also a drop down for frequency, but we don't need that to pull through on the form, as when we set up the asset we'll advise off the frequency, so when it comes to adding a record when the inspection's been done on the calendar, all we need to know is the last inspection date, and Logit will automatically calculate the next inspection date when that's entered. And we want to create. There we have our form created. The next step is to turn this into a record. As we know, forms are just creating the questions. After the form's created, you then have the ability to turn that form into the relevant workflow that you need. Click add record, confirm the record name, the department, and also the form that you want to pull through. The form that I'm pulling through is of course the form that we just created, and it's going to be completed at the location level. This may obviously vary on your setup. I know because I created it at the hotel, that is the top level, which is location. Assign the responsibilities, who's going to have access to complete the record. So this could be, the general manager. It could also be maintenance, or whoever else needs to have access to this. Please note that anyone who's going to be completing the record needs to be within the monitor for the documents. Manager, who's going to be managing the records, and observer, users who are not going to be completing the record, but people within head office or senior management who need to have an oversight of this so they can run reports in the back end. Click create. Then want to go to our calendar, and the calendar that I want to create will be called Stat Compliance Calendar. Select the calendar name. The owner is going to be left in organisation, so it can be done company-wide. Maintenance department, done at location level, and attach the responsibilities who you want to be able to access the calendar. Please note that if you create a new calendar and you can't see it on your 9-dot menu, please head over to the roles and ensure that on the monitor section you have the ability to view calendars. And maintenance. When you create your calendar, please ensure that the department and the completed by entity matches the same as the information that you attach to your record. They need to match, otherwise they won't be able to be used together. And click create. Once that's been created, I want to go over to the properties tab to let the calendar know what information they need to monitor. In this case, it's going to be attached property, confirm the asset group that you want to pull through, the template that we created, and we want to monitor the next inspection date. You'll see that if I attach another property, and I also want to pull through the external stat compliance, that can be done as well. Please bear in mind though, I've not created a record from my external stat compliance group, so this will definitely need to be done if you're pulling through multiple asset groups onto the one calendar. As I said, make sure you create a record for each individual asset group that you have created, and click attach. So there we have our calendar created. Before I show you this on the monitor portal, we did say that calendars can also be used for contractors and repositories. If you want to pull through repositories onto the calendar, the workflow is pretty similar. Head down to the repositories, just like we've done on the asset group. Select manage, over to properties, and then you can start adding your template to the repositories. And when you add a picture to that repository, we can pull through this onto the calendar. If you're pulling through contractor details, head down to contractors, select manage, and again there we have our properties that we have created for the contractors. And it works exactly the same as asset groups. As we're creating this at the top level of contractors, every contractor that's created underneath will automatically have all of the properties that we have created on the contractor. And when it comes to pulling through this information onto the calendar, again, all we want to do is create the form, make sure the form type matches the workflow that you want to pull through, i.e. asset groups, calendar, repositories. Once that's done, you would attach property and then select you want to pull through document types, you want to pull through the details of the next review date, etc. So now we have our template created, we have our asset groups created, we have our assets created, we have our properties created against the asset group, we have the last inspection date, the frequencies attached to each asset, as well as the form and record and the calendar created. When I head up to the three dots, back over to the front end of Logit, head down to the calendar, find the drop down box for the calendar that you have created, and we have our pat testing asset that we created which says it's overdue, and also our annual boiler service asset that we have created. Please note that if you create a calendar and it's not pulling through these details, double check that you have the last inspection date and the frequency created against the asset event type. As soon as these details are created and you pull through the properties on the calendar, it should then pull through. So once you have this set up and you now say, I want to add something onto the calendar, what do I need to do? Very simple. All you need to do is head back over to the configure portal, and as we have the backbone of the calendar created, all we need to do then is create another asset. This asset could then be water risk assessment. Select the location it's going to be completed at, and then the department. Hit create. Locate the asset that you created. Click edit. Confirm the last inspection date, as well as the frequency, and this will automatically now pull through onto the calendar because we have entered the inspection date, we've entered the frequency, and the asset group internal stat compliance is being pulled through onto the calendar created. And you'll see we now have our new asset event created called water risk assessment, and it's pulling through on the calendar. So now the calendar's been created, we want to know how we manage this going forward. Once it's all up and running and we now know that the pat testing has been done, to enter the inspection date, all you would do is click the little cog, add record, and you can see that the record that we created of pulling through the inspection date and the certificate is now pulling through. So now if I enter the date, attach your certificate, and then it will then allow me to submit it, you'll see it automatically reschedules the pat testing for the following year depending on the frequency. Now, we might want to know that a year down the line we want to view the certificates from previously completed stat compliance events. To do so, and you know you want to view the certificate for the pat testing, an easy way to do this is head to the three dots, go to the asset, locate the asset group and click update. Click edit on your asset and you can see that we have the certificate that I just attached on the record on the monitor portal on the calendar. It then pulls through onto the asset created. And you can also have a historic view by clicking the little history button, and it will show you all PDFs attached to the particular asset. So I hope this gave you a good understanding of how calendars are created and why they're created certain ways. I really appreciate you joining today, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to ask myself at the end of this webinar. I hope you have a fantastic day, guys, and I will see you next time.